Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Southern Skies, Stargazing in South Africa, and it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Lorraine Doyle. Lorraine, thank you so much for being here today, and I especially appreciate that you brought one of my favorite subjects today, so I can't wait to dive in.
Great. Thanks so much, Sunny. It's great to be here again. And yeah, this is also, it's been one of my passions for a very long time. Just basically being able to look out at the amazing skies that we have here in the Southern Hemisphere. Um, so, so just a sort of a brief overview. I'm just going to start off with a little bit of an astronomy introduction, if you will, and then move on to some of the major constellations that we get to see here in our southern skies, and then some of the folklore that is associated with them from a Southern African perspective, because I think for a lot of people, much of the folklore or legend that surrounds constellations is largely Northern Hemisphere driven. And so I've been fortunate over the years to pick up some of the Southern African stories that surround constellations, which I hope people will be interested to hear about today. So for those people who haven't watched any of these before, this is a photo of me taken in one of my favorite places, which is in the Kalahari Desert. Not least because you have extraordinary skies. They're obviously very dark skies, and dark skies are always really fantastic for stargazing. So as I said, just starting off with a little bit of an overall astronomy overview. And if we think about where our place, if you will, in the universe is, we as the solar system that is Earth and the Sun and the planets that revolve around our star, which we call Sun. So we are basically part of the Milky Way galaxy, and this is just a stylized picture of the Milky Way galaxy. It's known as a barred spiral galaxy, and as you can see, it has a number of spiral arms. And as you can see, where that little arrow is that points to our sun, this is where we essentially sit. So not only do we not sit at the center of the universe, we don't even sit at the center of our own galaxy. We sit quite a way out on one of the spiral arms, known as the Orion arm. And that, as you can see, there's a rotation arrow. So everything that we look at from a astronomical perspective, everything is in rotation around something. And so as we are in rotation around our sun, the sun is in rotation within our galaxy. Just another thing that's always really incredible to me is when we're looking out into space, we're pretty much always looking back in time. And that for me always conjures up so many questions. Even if you think about the light that hits us from the sun, it takes it 8 minutes from leaving the sun to hitting us here on Earth. And so everything is, if you will, some sort of a time warp. So when we look at talking about astronomy and distances, we're not going to talk a lot about it tonight, but I think one of the terms that gets used quite substantially in any astronomy context is the concept of a light year. And a light year is just a very convenient way of taking an enormous number of noughts and making it a lot smaller. And so a light year is really looking at the distance in kilometers per second, which light travels at, which is 300,000 kilometers per second, multiplied by the number of seconds in a year. And that gives us a light year, which translates to a distance. And as you can see, it's much easier to wrap your head around the concept of 1 light year rather than trying to deal with 10 trillion kilometers. And so the reason for just raising that is, if we think about our little place in space, so this is now a side-on view of our galaxy, and it really just shows where we are, 25,000 light years from the center of our own galaxy, and our galaxy is approximately 100,000 light years across. So these are all just very big numbers. And like I said, it's not really something that I want to dwell on too much tonight. But I think what it does do is for me, whenever I'm out there looking up into the night sky, it always just puts back into context for me, kind of, in a way, how small we are in the bigger scheme of things. So just, if we now take a kind of a more terrestrial view, if you will, of the Milky Way, when we look up into our night sky, particularly in the southern hemisphere, we see this band across the sky and we say, well, that's the Milky Way. But what we're actually looking at there is we're looking down that spiral arm that we are situated on. And particularly from the southern hemisphere, we are actually looking down that spiral arm towards the center of our galaxy. And so we have this incredible concentration of stars that we get to see from the southern hemisphere, more so than you get to see from the northern hemisphere. And one of the stories that I love, and a lot of the sort of more traditional Southern African stories come from some of the original peoples of Southern Africa, the San people. And one of the San legends is that there was a young girl who decided that there needed to be a path for the hunters to be able to find their way home. So the San people were very much hunter-gatherer communities. They weren't pastoralists. And so what she did was she took the sparks from the fire and threw those up into the sky. And then as a result, what was left was this road of stars, which was there to guide the hunters home. And I just think that's just such a lovely way of looking at it, that these are essentially cinders that were thrown up into space to form this path that was the way home. Also, and we'll come to it a little bit more just now, looking at the fact that stars actually have different colors, and there is a reason for that. There's another San story around the colors of stars, really, and essentially it says that there was a very strong-willed girl, and the family were roasting some roots on a fire. And for whatever reason, the mother decided that she wasn't going to give any of these roasted roots to the girl at the time. And so the girl got angry and she threw the roots and the ashes up into the sky. And those red and white roots now glow as red and white stars in the night sky. So I just think those are just really beautiful stories about this Milky Way, or this path of stars. So we sit in a neighborhood, just as we do on Earth. And just to give it a little bit of context, so this is a Hubble Space Telescope picture of Andromeda Galaxy. And Andromeda is the nearest major galaxy to our own. And we believe that our galaxy looks very similar to this. So this is about 2 million light years away. So any light that hits us today from Andromeda would have left there 2 million years ago. And it's likely that many of the stars have already been extinguished, but that light is only reaching us now. So this is our neighbor, if you will, as far as major galaxies go. But in the southern hemisphere, we also have 2 minor galaxies. And these are known as the large and the small Magellanic Clouds, named after Ferdinand Magellan, the Portuguese sailor who circumnavigated the globe. And people from the northern hemisphere will often say, yes, but there are these blurry patches in the sky. And that is actually these 2 minor galaxies. And they are always visible because they're quite close to the South Celestial Pole. They never set. And so when you're in the southern hemisphere looking out in the night sky, you will, if it's a clear night, you will always see these hazy patches. And these particular galaxies are one of the reasons why we have so many observatories in the southern hemisphere, because these galaxies basically are not visible if you're 17 degrees north of the equator. And so they have got a lot of star matter in them, a lot of interstellar dust. And so a lot of work has been done on them, which has given us a lot of information about stars and things in our own galaxies. There's an interesting story, and I'm not exactly sure from which tribe it comes, but one of the stories is that the Large Magellanic Cloud is a puff of smoke from a pipe smoking contest that was held. I'm not exactly sure where, but particularly the Large Magellanic Cloud gets referred to as this puff of smoke from a pipe smoking contest. So that's not a typo. It's not meant to say starlight. It is meant to say star life. And the reason for that is that stars have a life cycle. So stars are born, stars go through middle age, and stars die. And as a result of the temperatures of stars as they go through those different phases of their life cycle, they have different colors. And so this is another Hubble Space Telescope picture. Hubble really, for a very long time, revolutionized how we were able to look at both our galaxy and further beyond. And this is one in a star cloud in the constellation of Sagittarius. And it's just a particularly nice one in that it really gives you an idea of the really different colors of stars that are out there. And so you can see some blue-white stars there, and those are very young stars. And they've got a surface temperature of probably between 10 and 20,000 degrees centigrade. Then you've got yellow stars, and our sun is a middle-aged yellow star, about 5,600 degrees centigrade at surface. And then you've got red stars, and red stars are dying stars. And so these are stars that have a surface temperature around 2,000 degrees centigrade. And and we'll have a look now at one which is in the constellation of Scorpio, another one in the constellation of Orion, which are supermassive red giants. and these stars are now at the end phases of their life. And so essentially the ways that stars form is they form in nurseries. You have these, like in the Orion Nebula, you have a similar one in the tail of Scorpius, and these are places where you have large concentrations of dust and gas. Ultimately what happens is you get a fusion reaction happening, and essentially hydrogen is converted to helium plus energy, and as a result of that, light is given off. And so that fusion reaction continues to go on for the lifespan of that star. And when that fusion reaction is no longer sustainable, that is when the star essentially dies. And the bigger the star, or the more massive the star rather, the shorter it lives, because they burn massive amounts of their fuel. So we won't talk too much about it, but at any point, if anyone's interested, it's really cool to understand a little bit more about what happens to these stars when they go, whether they go supernova, whether they become supermassive black holes. But for now, it was just a case of just looking at the different colors. When we look out into the night sky, some of these are very obviously different colors. And another thing that, another story I love is that both the San people and the Tswana people of South Africa believe that at night, as it gets cooler, the sun draws a blanket around itself. But the blanket is an old blanket and it has a lot of little holes in it. And as a result of the little holes, that is the stars that we see shining through the black of the blanket that the sun has pulled around itself. So this is kind of the more typical thing when we start talking about constellations, the types of pictures that we see if we look at sky maps or star maps. But so for me, there's sort of two ways that we can look at constellations, and constellations are just pictures, if you will, comprised of a combination of stars. There's 88 major constellations, but we can categorize them, we can use them to find our way around the night sky, but they're also in a way sort of collective memories. If you think about the San people looking back, if you think about even further back, a lot of stars have got Arabic names from Arabic astronomers. So our relationship with the stars and with constellations goes back many, many millennia. And so it's always thinking about it when we look out there and we look at these constellations, there is that element of connection to essentially to our shared past. But this is a typical night sky winter for us in the southern hemisphere. So from here we're talking obviously from June through September. So typical of when NatHab does its African or Southern African safaris, this is the main sort of constellation picture that we would be seeing over those months. And you'll see there's a couple here that Scorpius is probably the dominant one of our night sky during the winter months. The Southern Cross is not visible always. It does dip below the horizon at some points, but for the most part, it's visible. And then Sagittarius is a major constellation that is visible in our winter night sky. So if we look at our summer night sky, it's obviously it's a little different. Like I said, the small and large Magellanic Clouds, although they've put them here in the summer night sky, they are actually visible all year round. But what happens is, as with Orion, Orion is visible in our winter sky, but not in our night sky. It becomes a very, very early morning constellation, but Orion dominates our night sky during our summer months, which essentially we're looking from October through May, when these tend to dominate more. So again, Orion, you will of course see the Southern Cross as well, even though they haven't put it on here. Canis Major, associated with Orion, one of Orion's hunting dogs. And then the Great Square of Pegasus, and the Pleiades, which I'll chat a little bit more about. You can see the Pleiades in the very early morning in winter, usually around about sort of hoppers 5 in the morning. The Pleiades also become visible then. And then this, I just thought was quite a lovely example of what I was talking about in terms of the mythology of the local Southern African people. So you can see here that where you see the main kind of bulge of the Milky Way that we see, it's their footpath across the sky. And then you've got, and we'll talk about this, some of the things, their legends around the Southern Cross, Orion and the hunter's arrows. You've also got, this here is the Pleiades, or Isimela, as it's called very often in local languages. You have here a flock of birds, and then obviously this is part of the constellation of Leo the lion. But for me, it's just lovely that, again, this is just looking at it from a southern hemisphere perspective rather than the classical sort of northern hemisphere perspective, which most people are more acquainted with, largely because a lot of work originally was done in northern hemisphere environments. So just to quickly look at a couple of these constellations. So the pointers are part of a larger constellation. They're part of the constellation of Centaurus. And the reason they're called the pointers is that these are the stars that point to the Southern Cross, and which I'll show you just now in the context of where they are in relation to the Southern Cross. But what's interesting about this is that this system here, and I call it a system because it's actually, there are 3 stars within this system. This is the closest star to us after our sun. So we're talking here about 4.2, 4.5 light years away. And the dullest star in this system, which is not visible here, is a star called Proxima Centauri. And it was actually discovered by a gentleman called Robert James in 1915. And it was actually using a telescope here in Johannesburg, in South Africa, that Proxima Centauri was actually first visualized. So the Southern Hemisphere does have a history in terms of some of the stars in our night sky. So although these 2 stars from this picture look kind of equally bright, this is a much more, Beta Centauri is a much more luminous star. It's sitting about, I think, 690 light years away, so much, much further away, but still a very highly luminescent star. So Crux is the scientific name, if you will, that's given to the Southern Cross. And just to point out where the cross is here. So it's made up of 4 main stars. So the bottom one, Alpha Centauri, Beta Centauri, Gamma, and Delta. And so those are the 4 stars that make up the main cross, which also looks a little bit like a kite. So these are the key stars, if you will, within the constellation of the Crux. There's a few interesting other things associated with the Crux, and one of those is this here, which is known as the jewel box. And the jewel box was actually named by a gentleman called William Herschel. And he just said that it looked like this beautiful box of jewels, hence the name that it got given. So it's a cluster of about 100 stars. And if you look at it through binoculars, you can actually see a number of these bright stars, even better looked at through even a small telescope. But you do get a sense of these beautiful stars and the different colors in them, even through a pair of binoculars. And then just below it, you will notice this incredibly dark area. And this is known as the coal sack. And really what this is this is just an interstellar, so between stars, area of dust and gas, so a very dark area of sky that is blocking out the stars behind it. And so obviously, given the darkness of it, is how it got its name, the coal sack. So what's interesting, and if we think about that, this is one of the most dominant constellations within the southern sky. Some of the history behind it, or the legend behind it, is that these 4 bright stars are a journey of female giraffe. And the 2 pointer stars, Alpha and Beta Centauri, are a pair of bull giraffes who are in pursuit of these females. There's another version of it which says that the cross, if you will, is the head of a giant giraffe, and the pointers are sort of the neck of the giraffe. The only challenge with that is that obviously as this rotates around the south celestial pole, this poor giraffe kind of gets a little bit of a kink in its neck. Another legend that goes with it is that the stars of the cross are actually a pride of lionesses, and the pointers are 2 pride males following the females across the sky. So whichever of the ones it is, a journey of giraffe or a pride of lionesses, it's a pretty cool depiction. So using the stars to find direction can be fairly dubious, but one of the pretty accurate ones is using the Southern Cross or the Crux to find south. And essentially what you do is you take a line that goes down the long axis of the cross, and then you do a line between the pointers, Alpha and Beta Centauri, and then you draw a perpendicular bisector. And where those 2 imaginary lines meet is what we know as the south celestial pole. And you then drop a line to the horizon, and that will give you south. And this was a navigational aid that was used by early sailors. However, they were on occasion led astray because the false cross, which I don't have a picture of here, but the false cross lies about 25 degrees northwest of the Southern Cross. And unfortunately, it proved a bit of a nemesis to some of the early navigators trying to navigate around the Cape of Good Hope, because if they mistook it for the Southern Cross, they would think they were further south than they were. And what would happen is they would then turn their ships to round the Cape and they would run aground. And there are quite a lot of shipwrecks along the Cape Coast, the southwest coast of South Africa, that are a result of navigational error based on using the false cross rather than the true Southern Cross. And so the way of knowing whether it's the true Southern Cross or not is you have to look for the pointers. But there are occasions where the Southern Cross is just skimming the horizon, but the pointers are below it. And so potentially, I guess that's where navigators may have found their way into a little bit of trouble. So, as I said, the constellation which dominates the night sky here during our winter months is Scorpius, or the Scorpion. And like the cross, it is one of those constellations where you can actually see a picture that resembles something that you could associate with whatever it's said to look like. Not all constellations are like that. So, for example, you have one here close to the Southern Cross called Musk of the Fly, and it looks like a squashed rectangle. But Scorpius actually does look like a scorpion. And so those are the stars that form the head of the scorpion. And then you have the body of the scorpion, if you will, that goes all the way down here. And then right at the end, you have the sting in the tail, which is actually, this is also a nebula. So this is basically a star nursery right in the sting of the tail. So this star here is a star known as Antares, or the rival of Mars, because it's this super red giant. And just to give you an idea of how big this star is that if we were to put it where our sun is, it would extend out to the orbit between Mars and Jupiter. So we would be inside it, just to give you an idea of how massive this star is. So the certain of the Bushman clans used to call it the fire finishing star because it has this reddish color, but it sets very late at night when all the campfires would have died down. And I guess that's how they came up with the idea that it was the fire finishing star. So I think that's also a pretty neat story. So Sagittarius is quite an obscure constellation, but it has within it something known as an asterism. And an asterism is really a picture within a picture. And the asterism within Sagittarius is known as the teapot. Now, you might wonder if you're looking at that picture now where the teapot is. So there is the handle of the teapot. Those four stars make up the pot of the teapot. There's the lid, there's the spout, and here is all of the steam that is coming out of the spout of the teapot. And one of the things, this is a very prevalent in our night skies during the winter. And what's amazing about this is when you look in the direction of Sagittarius, you are looking right down the Orion arm, right into the center of the Milky Way galaxy. And so it's really, really cool to be able to do that and to know that you're sort of looking down right into the center of the galaxy, where we know that ultimately at the center there's the supermassive black hole. The rest of the constellation of Sagittarius is made up of a lot of very small dim stars, and is really, really not very easy to see. So Orion is obviously a well-known constellation in the Northern Hemisphere. And for people living in the Northern Hemisphere, you see Orion the right way up. We see Orion upside down in the Southern Hemisphere. And essentially, it's because Orion lies very close to what we would consider the imaginary line that divides the northern and southern halves of the sky. And so when you view it from the southern hemisphere, you're literally seeing it back to front and upside down. And as you can see here, so we see Betelgeuse, which is the super red giant, which for you is the shoulder, the right way up. We see it here, upside down. And then Rigel, which is the other very bright star, which is one of the knees of Orion, we see here. So his belt is upside down, as is his sword, with the Orion Nebula. So the Orion Nebula is another famous nebula, which is another star nursery. So there's not a lot of specific African mythology associated with it. But a lot of cultures within Southern Africa, or Africa as a whole, have seen the belt of Orion. It's been seen as variously things from tortoises to warthogs. But the one I really like about the story I like is that warthogs have their litters when Orion is prominent in the sky. So that's in our summer months, and often their litters of little warthog piglets, they have 3 piglets, and so yeah, the belt of Orion is the three little piglets, which I just think is a really sweet story. So the Pleiades, this is another constellation that for Northern Hemisphere viewers is not an unknown. So it's an open star cluster, and it's often referred to as, people may have heard it called the Seven Sisters. We know that the 7th star in it is a very variable star in terms of its brightness, which is why it's often that only 6 of the 7 are really visible. But these stars are very, very significant in the Southern Hemisphere to pretty much all of the tribes. And they're known as, they call them Isilamela, or the digging stars. And their appearance in the southern sky basically tells of the time for starting to hoe the ground, so tilling the land, preparing for the time to come for when plowing, or rather where planting would be needed. And so it really served as a form of a calendar, if you will, throughout Southern Africa or African culture. And it's similar if you think about things like Stonehenge in Britain, just thinking about the way in which the main arch was oriented. That was designed so that the sun would shine through the central arch at the spring equinox. And so that was used very much as, this is a time when we need to now start planting. And so the stars, in one shape or another, have played a very big part in cultures across the globe, in terms of times of year, and particularly associated in early cultures with when to plow the land and when to plant. Um, as you will see, this sort of the very striking thing about the Pleiades is they're very blue-white stars, and this again is because they're very young stars, so very hot, sitting in that 10 to 20,000 degrees centigrade range at surface temperature. So yeah, this group of young stars that, and whether you're talking about the San people, the Tswanas, the Zulus, the Sutus, all of these people have different names for them, but they all have the same context of being a particular time of year when it's time to start getting the land ready. And then, of course, a star that perhaps we don't really think that much about in terms of when we think about astronomy or night skies, obviously, but our sun is obviously the most important star to us here on Earth. And the San people, again, have a lovely story about the sun. And they describe the sun as an old man who lived on Earth with all the other people. But he lived alone and he was very selfish. And he had a light that shone from his armpit, but only around his hut, so, or his living area, lighting his space and giving him warmth. And the other people who lived on Earth would collect white ants and termite larvae as food, but they couldn't dry them out to eat them because there wasn't warmth. And so as a result, these people were walking the earth in cold and darkness because sun was selfishly refusing to share warmth and light. And eventually, a group of boys of the first San people were instructed by their mother to take hold of the sun and throw him into the sky so that he shed his light and warmth for everybody. And they did this. And as a result of this, the sun is now present for everybody to enjoy. And this is very strong to the sort of social structure of the San people, this principle of sharing. And I was very fortunate quite a number of years ago now, but I did some work with the San people in the Kalahari. And I can attest to this very strong kind of sense of sharing and that things belong to everyone and to the earth. And so, this was part of that. There was no currency in their society. And so this whole concept of gifting was a really, really big and important thing for them. And so that whole idea that now the sun was now there for everybody, was is a lovely testament to their culture. So obviously we have the setting sun. We also get the rising sun, and sometimes it can almost, this picture when I took it, it was a very, very misty morning, and the bands on it look almost like they look to me almost like the planet Jupiter. And then obviously the other major light, if you will, in our night sky is the moon. I took this picture on one of the Secluded South Africa safaris in the Kalahari, up on the, at Madikwe Game Reserve, which is right on the edge of the Kalahari. And the San people as well have a lovely story about the moon. So they have a trickster god that they call Kachin, and apparently the moon is actually a really old shoe, and it was lost by the trickster when he was running errands for the gods. And so as it rises in the early evening, it has the red dust. It's red with dust from the Kalahari, so you get this beautiful red moon. But they also say that the sun is jealous of the moon when it's full, because that's a challenge, it's a rival to the sun's brightness. Um, and so they say that, and the way they explain the phases of the moon is that with its sharp rays, the sun cuts off bits of the moon until there's just a little bit left. And then essentially the sun is now cutting these strips from the moon until it's almost extinguished, almost gone. And then at the last moment, the moon begs for forgiveness for trying to compete with the sun. And the sun relents its attack and it allows the moon to recover until it becomes full again. And when that happens, the sun recommences its onslaught on the moon. And so, yeah, just another lovely African story, if you will, of how we look as people, how we look at out into our sky, and how we interpret these things that are out there. And then just this lovely illustration was done by the South African Astronomical Observatory. And it really is just sort of, as we've spoken about now, the girl throwing the ashes up into the sky. In this case, the journey of giraffe and the two other bull giraffes. Another story of some of the sand people is that the sun was eaten by a crocodile and then released every morning, which is why there's a crocodile here. And so, yeah, just a lovely visualization, if you will, of how the southern skies have been seen by local people for millennia. So that's really just kind of a whistle-stop tour through southern African skies. And yeah, if anyone's got questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Thanks, Sunny.
Thank you so much. I just love hearing the stories about the stars. So thank you. Let's see. On the scheduled South Africa trip, do they have an excursion that takes guests out at night to see the skies? Is there any month better than the others to see the stars?
So, yes, we do spend time out finding the darkest skies that we can. It obviously does depend a little bit on what cycle of the moon you're in. So it's preferable, obviously, if you really want to see the best of the stars, is to have a new moon, or anything up sort of first quarter. But all of the months where the NatHab safaris run to South Africa are generally really good months for stargazing, because it's through our winter months. So our winter months are generally dry, and cold air is also much more stable air. And so as a result of that, you also get better stargazing. So any of the safaris that run from June all the way through end of September, even into the beginning of October, those are all really good months. Our not so good months are when you get in from November all the way through to May, which is when we have our rainy season. And so any of the months that we go on Secluded South Africa are usually good months for stargazing.
Great. One of our viewers is curious to know if a few days ago, when the big solar flares were happening, if you were able to see the aurora where you are down south.
Not where I am, but in the Drakensberg, so the Drakensberg Mountains, they actually got some of the aurora. Very, very faint, but yes, they did actually get some aurora.
Neat.
Yeah.
Do you know if the SAN have any stories about solar eclipses?
Um, I don't know. I don't know if the San people do. I do know that the um, the Zulus will call solar eclipses. They actually call it the Day of the Dead. Well, the famous one was when the Battle of St. Luana happened, and it was a big battle between the Zulu and the British, and it was called the Day of the Dead Moon.
Hmm.
And basically, there was a belief that the the I'm not exactly sure why the dead moon, but there was definitely a lot of superstition around it. Um, but I don't know a lot about kind of the cultural beliefs around eclipses. I'm sure there's literature out there I could look at. And if people want to know, I'm happy to have a look. But I don't know off the top of my head.
Hmm. Do not some people see the dark areas in the Milky Way as animals?
So what's really interesting is one of the things when I was working with the San, the Kumani San. So there are many different clans of San people, and they all have quite different beliefs. Um, One of the things that for the Kumani San was, whereas we tend to look at, for example, the stars themselves, and we say, right, well, those four stars make up the Southern Cross. So we look at the picture made from the actual stars. What the Kamani Sun looked at was they looked at the spaces, the dark matter between the stars, and that was where they saw their pictures.
Hmm.
Um, but because language was such a big barrier, I never really got to understand better how exactly or what animals they saw. But it was very clear that they saw the pictures in the dark spaces between the stars, not in the way that we'd sort of join the dots.
Fascinating. Well, that is the last question we have today, so I will pass it back to you for closing comments.
Yeah, just really to say thank you so much for the opportunity to share this. And yeah, I really hope that some of the viewers will be able to join us in South Africa and actually see some of these constellations and amazing skies for themselves. So
Mm.
thanks again.
And thank you again. I really do enjoy hearing your stories and hearing all about the perspective that you get on the southern part of this beautiful earth. So thank you. I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. Please join us again tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.